Tashi from the American Anglican Council, here to begin a series of talks about something we have just published for you over the last few months. It's called the Daniel Declaration, a call to mission and a place to stand. In 1996, when we were formed, the American Anglican Council came up with a theological declaration of what is essential to following Jesus in the Anglican way. We called it a place to stand. And before other declarations came out, like the Jerusalem Declaration and the Cairo Covenant, the AAC's place to stand was kind of a gold standard for biblically faithful Anglicans in North America to gather around and say, this is what we believe. This is the foundation for our fellowship together and our moving forward in mission. And of course, here we are presenting a new version of a place to stand, only we're calling it instead the Daniel Declaration. And I'm sure you're wondering, why another declaration and why Daniel? So let me just say a few things about that first question. Why now? Why a new declaration of what it means to be biblically faithful as an Anglican in North America today? Well, the reality is that it's been almost 25 years or more since 1996 when we published A Place to Stand. And since then, we've experienced a sea change in our culture. And just some bullet points to consider about that. We've got sexuality issues that we were addressing back in 1996 and the advances of technology that are eroding moral values in our culture and all over the world. Now, we're not here to say we're against sex and we're against the internet, but we're simply observing what others have observed, that this combination is doing what the psalmist lamented in Psalm 11, verse 3. What can the righteous do when the foundations are being destroyed? Great scholars like Alistair MacIntyre and Carl Trueman have written about after virtue and the rise and triumph of the modern self, where the modern Enlightenment thinking has given way to the loss of any objective moral compass, the emergence of the modern narcissistic and emotive self as the only point of reference. And that's compounded not only by sex and technology, by the failure of politics, education, the law, and other secular institutions, the rise of a kind of soft totalitarianism, as people like Rod Dreher and others have observed, and the cancel culture, and a new aggressive secularism, that is a belief that Christianity is no longer an option even to be tolerated, but rather a threat to be contained and extinguished. And the reality is that we are closer to Babylon than we are to Jerusalem. Presenting issue of our day in this great Anglican Reformation is, what does it mean to be human with dignity and value and purpose? That is at the heart of what we're going to be addressing in this Daniel Declaration. And we have an engagement crisis before us. The engagement crisis is, do we curse the culture or do we compromise with it? And unfortunately, many churches have been doing one or the other, and as a result, they won't be ready to accept the great flood of refugees of this increasingly secularizing and secular culture, whose promises to the modern emotive self cannot be fulfilled. So we're going to argue that it's time for us to transform the culture, not accommodate to it, not reject it, but transform it. And that's where Daniel comes in. I want to just make some observations about why did we choose Daniel. It's no coincidence that the first and one of the greatest commentaries that the church fathers ever published was Hippolytus' commentary on Daniel during persecution in the Roman Empire. And so there we are. We're looking at someone the earliest church fathers recognized as a prime example of what it means to be a courageous Christian working within a hostile environment for transformation. Why Daniel? Well, because Daniel recognized that God was in charge and had led them to Babylon. Daniel and his three companions never lost sight of their identity in Yahweh, what the Apostle Paul would say from Ephesians 1, our fundamental identity in Christ as human beings. They resolved to follow the law, which they'd been taught, and they knew where to draw the line. And they drew it at the king's table in the cafeteria and refused to eat non-kosher food. But what did they do in the spirit in which they did it? They did it in a way that was completely respectful of the king's eunuch, the king's servant. They struck a bargain with him and said, look, try us out on vegetables and see if we're not going to be better. See if we don't add value to your culture, Mr. Eunuch, as a result of our keeping our law and our being faithful to our God. And by golly, they were found to be 10 times better than all the others who were eating at the king's table. And the chapter ends with saying, Daniel served in the king's court with more wisdom, more insight, more divine revelation than all of the other Chaldeans and other magicians, sorcerers, and consultants to the king. And he remained there until the first year of King Cyrus. Someone's done a wonderful look at that time period, and that would be like somebody saying in our culture today that they'd been so valued, they'd added so much value to the culture and to leaders that if they were like Daniel and were that resilient, they would have been counselors in the presidencies of Gerald Ford, Jimmy Carter, Ronald Reagan, Bush 1, Bill Clinton, Bush 2, and Obama. That's a lot. And that's exactly the kind of person that Danny was, and exactly the kind of people that we are calling all of us to be in the Anglican Church in North America through this Daniel Declaration. So we hope you'll enjoy this series, that it will inform you, that it will challenge you, and that you will be able to draw practical resources and lessons on how to be that kind of a leader wherever you are, in the church, in your family, in your neighborhood, in the workplace. God bless you. Well, I'm here with two dear friends, both of whom are trustees of the American Anglican Council. Adam McLeod, who is going to be a new professor of jurisprudence at St. Mary's University in San Antonio, Texas, with lots of new research and writing. He's already a prolific writer in the area of natural law and jurisprudence. So Adam, it's a joy to have you with us in this series. And my dear friend, Rich Baker, whom I have known for years as a compatriot in the Christian Legal Society. Rich works with churches in Chicago through a Christian law firm, Malkin Baker. And they help churches navigate the very complex and challenging legal landscape, with challenges under sexual orientation, gender identity laws, on religious freedom, religious land use, all kinds of things. So Rich, it's a delight to have you here too. Well, we've just published this Daniel Declaration, and it's a place to stand, it's a call to mission. And we've talked a little bit about why Daniel and why now. But clearly, we've done this series to help people in local churches be able to talk about the issues of the day with confidence. And I suppose I come back to a question, Adam, that you suggested that we ask, which is in a culture where there is now a post-Christian culture in which there is no objective truth, no moral compass, and where the feelings of the autonomous self, for lack of a better term, seem to trump everything. is, both of you, is communication about these kinds of things with our friends and neighbors even possible?
Mr. Natural Law, go ahead.
Yeah, well, I think it is. I do.
I do too.
I think it's not only possible, but I've actually seen it done. It's like Mark Twain's famous quip about infant baptism. I think it's often the case. We see our neighbors, particularly those who suffer from too much education, we might say, make claims like the following: well, all truth is relative, or all truth is subjective, right? I have my truth, you have your truth.
Right.
Or make a more fundamental claim about human nature, that what it is to know, what it is to understand, is fundamentally about subjective experience, right? That it's my experience of the world that matters. So you see various claims made, which we see this in the popular press. We certainly see it in schools and colleges and universities, all the various culture-shaping institutions and knowledge-shaping institutions into which we send our children and to which we ourselves go frequently. Call it relativism, call it subjectivism. So these claims are put forward quite frequently. And yet, if you watch the way that the folks who make those claims, watch the way they actually act in the world. They act,
or with their own kids.
Or with their own kids.
That's exactly right.
If it's the case that all is relative or subjective, if everything's a social construct, let's start there. Why do you buckle your seatbelt when getting in the car, right? Or as a friend of mine said on social media this week, why do you come through the door and not try to come through the wall? Right? Yeah. By their conduct, all human beings, that is all of us, demonstrate that we know certain things to be true. Yeah. We know that there are things that are true about the world, the natural order that we inherit, that we encounter, but we're not powerful to reshape on our own. We know that there are certain things that are true about good and the right and the true and the beautiful. And so if you look at the way people act in the world, if you look at the way they exercise their practical reason as they go about solving the various problems and pursuing the various opportunities that they have throughout the day and throughout their lives, you often will be confirmed in your suspicion that they actually do believe that there is an objective truth. There are things worth affirming as true, and there are things that are objectively worth pursuing by their choices and actions.
Yeah. So I'd answer, absolutely agree with you on all of that. But the question that you almost asked is, at what level am I talking? If I'm talking to the elite, that's one kind of conversation. But if I'm talking to like the Uber driver that I had this morning who picked me up, I just wait and I just listen a little bit and find out where they are. And then we just begin to talk, and they get it. They know what life is really about, and they're working hard and they're trying to figure out how to make enough money to survive and everything like that. And they're not in the upper echelons trying to live in a way that is contrary to human life. So I think it's who you're talking to and how much need there is in their lives. That's where humility comes in. God will humble us because we don't listen unless we're humble. At least that's my experience.
Yeah. So as trustees who played a big role in drafting this Daniel Declaration, do you see any connection between Daniel and what we just talked about in terms of how we communicate with people?
Well, absolutely. I think the biggest danger is not that we find ourselves unable to defend the truth. The truth is what it is. We didn't constitute it, and we can't make it any less true. The danger is that we lose our courage. The real temptation, the real problem with claims like the claim that all truth is socially constructed, or that everything fundamentally reduces to power and oppression and exploitation, themes we'll be talking about over the next a few hours here. The real problem with that is that it's passed on to young people as a way of rationalizing choices that we all know to be false.
Right.
Affirmations that we know to be false, and actions that we know to be unhealthful for us and destructive of ourselves and our relationships. And so there's all sorts of ways in which one can go wrong. One can go wrong in one's thinking. One can go wrong by succumbing to physical temptations, and one can go wrong by succumbing to moral temptations. And so the response to all three of those sets of temptations, of course, is courage. Right. Intellectual courage, physical courage, and moral courage. There's a great Christian tradition of thinking about the importance of just doing the next right thing, regardless of the consequences.
Yes.
This is a lesson I think we can learn from Daniel, that he had the courage to know not only what was true and not only that when he spoke the truth would ultimately be vindicated, but more importantly, he knew who the author of the truth was. Yeah. And he knew that the author of the truth, the true God, would ultimately be glorified and would prevail.
Yeah, thinking about one outstanding characteristic of Daniel is that he always worked with whatever administration was there, whether it was Medes, Persians, Babylonians. And Rich, I think in your practice, you work with the administration of laws. So how do you see Daniel sort of helping you in that kind of
There's a story that I love. So there's a new law passed, and you gotta worship and do all this, contrary to what he knows he can do. Yeah. So what does he do? He doesn't broadcast, I'm not gonna do that. He goes to his room, shuts the door, and continues his life without being intimidated. Mm. And I think that that's a challenge for me, because I get intimidated, and I think many of us do. I've also learned that I can't do this on my own. Yeah. I'm not a lone ranger. At one time I thought, if everybody falls away from God, I'm going to stand strong. I've got to be able to stand alone. And I now say, I can't stand alone. I must have first the Spirit of God and then his people standing with me. And you'll notice Daniel had others standing with him. He was not alone. Yeah. So I think a word that comes back to me is intimidation and learning to face the intimidation that this culture is definitely wanting us to feel and knowing how to respond to it. So,
yeah. I'm just thinking a little bit about what you said earlier, Adam, about intimidation as well. And I know you've dealt in your teaching with students who are feeling very intimidated, younger generations, and you've shared some interesting things about interactions you've had with them, of listening, but giving them a space to really talk.
Yeah, I mean, one of the big problems of our age, of course, is this idea that that I identify with fill in the blank, right? I identify as part of this group, or whether it's an ethnic group or racial group, or with a particular orientation, or with a particular religious identity, any of these. And so what happens is then we end up in a trench warfare where any discussion about some truth proposition becomes an attack on someone's person and someone's personal identity. Right. That really raises the stakes. Mm-hmm. And the students that I teach in law school classrooms and undergraduate seminars as well, they've really been bitten hard by this in their time, in a way that I think was not as prevalent 10, 15, 20 years ago. Mm-hmm. My experience of young people is they're actually not nearly as assertive and confident as you might think. Mm-hmm. They're really in some cases almost terrified, almost paralyzed with anxiety about pursuing truth, pursuing knowledge of truth, because they're terrified that they're going to step on some social landmine somewhere that they don't perceive. That asking a particular question that they find interesting and important might actually be tied to someone's personal identity and be taken personally in a way that really shuts down any further conversation and then makes them look as if they're mean or bullying or vicious in some way. And so I think that's a real anxiety, particularly amongst young people. So I think one way to combat that is to simply affirm that there are questions worth asking because they can lead us to knowledge of truth for its own sake. And I think the lesson for us as Christians is quite clear, and that is there's a temptation for us as Christians to take it personally when people question the truth claims of Christianity, whether it's the gospel, the historicity of the resurrection, the moral claims of the Christian and natural law, ethical and philosophical traditions, to say, well, no, look, my identity is Christian, or I have my worldview and you have your worldview. And we're just falling right back into the same trap. And that really closes the door on really fruitful dialogue. But instead to just affirm, well, let's place this truth claim here on the table. And let's examine what might be implicated if it were true. What might go better about our lives, your life and my life, if it's the case, for example, that there are objective moral truths, that life has value, that there's a God who designed the created order for us to live in, and that's very good as originally designed. What does that mean for our lives if these things turn out to be true? And then demonstrate by our actions how to have this conversation, how to absorb criticisms and skepticism and questions in a way that we don't find it threatening, and we think these questions are worth exploring.
I think that's another definition of loving, actually. And that's rather than the loving that is so tolerant that it can't allow for any disagreement. It's a loving that's calling people forth for what they are, and which is lacking. I would come from a different perspective on this. I had a Chinese graduate student that I was working with. And so he'd been in my Bible class, and he was going back to China the next day. So he says, I want to have lunch with you. Okay. And he'd yell at me in class, and he was really fighting hard. And so I thought, well, what's this going to be? So he sat down and he says, Baker, I know you talk about truth. He says, well, I'm into reality. And in my head, I'm going, wait a minute. Isn't truth and reality connected? But what he was talking about is the intimidation. He knew that if he lived in a particular way that pursued the truth, the reality for him is he'd meet a great deal of persecution in China when he went back. So I watched him working with those two concepts, and a love for something that's real and true, and yet a reality that if I follow the truth, this is going to cost me a great deal. And I think we're facing that now. One of my hopes with the Daniel Declaration is helping us to prepare to pursue the truth when the reality that we'll face for that truth may be difficult. So that's a big part of what I think Daniel is.
And in fact, Daniel provides us with the example of the non-anxious, it's not about me, loving, willing to face persecution, risk-taking stand for truth. That's at the heart of this declaration.